Welcome to Down to Earth but Heavenly Minded podcast. Hosted by Irving Risch. Light from the Land of the Sphinx. Chapter 21, The Rock, the Victory, the Rest. Israel was in the arid, stony waste of sin, the glory cloud stood over them, and the bounty of the heaven-sent manna was about their camp, their supplies of water were run out, and they were afflicted with thirst. The fact that God fed them with bread from heaven did not appease their longings, neither did it suggest to them that he who bestowed upon them bread, could also find them water. They had no faith, and said sullenly to Moses, Wherefore is this that thou hast brought us up out of Egypt? To kill us and our children and our cattle with thirst. Exodus chapter 17 verse 3, and in their rebellion they were ready to stone him. Verses 4 and 5, they were far more rebellious than they had been before the gift of the manna. Before this they murmured, now they had not only murmured, but strove, from the root rib, to strive vehemently, literally to seize, especially by the hair, whence the name Meribah, the place of striving. They also tempted the Lord, ver. 7. The word used here for to tempt is Massa, whence the name Massa, the place of temptation. See Deuteronomy chapter 6 verse 16, Deuteronomy chapter 33 verse 8. Moses laid the case before Jehovah, and he uttered not one word of reproach at Israel's hardness of heart, but in perfect goodness bade his servant to go on before the people, and to take with him of the elders. And in his hand the rod with which he had smitten the river of Egypt, and stand before the rock. And, said Jehovah, Behold, I will stand before thee there upon the rock in Horeb, and thou shalt smite the rock, and there shall come water out of it, that the people may drink. Exodus chapter 17 verse 6. Thus were the river of Egypt and the rock in the wilderness brought into close moral association by the rod of divine judgment. Sin calls for judgment. Israel's rebellion cried for it, but the blow was to fall, not on Israel, but on the rock. The rod was not to destroy them, it was to be the means of their life. The cloud of the divine presence led the way, and it halted upon the rock, for the glory of God was there. Behold, I will stand before thee there upon the rock in Horeb. The leader and the elders of Israel gathered round the rock, and the people massed themselves together to behold the ways of God. The rod which in Egypt had turned life into death, was in the wilderness about to turn death into life. Then, as he had been bidden, Moses struck the rock, and from the smitten rock the waters gushed out, they ran in the dry places like a river. Psalm chapter 105 verse 41. Israel drank of the life stream, and, with children and cattle, were satisfied. The scripture interprets the symbolism of the rock, that rock was Christ. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 verse 4. From Christ, smitten by the judgment of God for rebellious man, from him once crucified, the life stream flows out to the world. The glory of Jehovah stands over the cross of Christ. There it abides morally forever. There is no other meeting place with God than this for sinful needy men. And in this world the wilderness is the meeting place found. From Christ once suffering under divine judgment on earth, but now glorified in heaven, the Holy Spirit communicates to such as thirst life, satisfaction, and joy. If any man thirst, says Jesus, let him come unto me, and drink. John chapter 7 verse 37. Thus does the last week, before the Mount of God was reached, open up its eternal lessons Meribah, and Massa, are not to be forgotten. See Psalm chapter 78 verses 20 to 22. A strange Arab legend hovers over the locality, for though the precise position of the rock cannot be given, still the general features of the Wadi Faran answer to the story of the scriptures. Before the fertile valley comforts eye and foot, there is a stretch of terribly arid rocky desolation. And, immediately before the part of the valley where the fertility commences, is a rock which Arab tradition regards as the site of the miracle. This rock is surrounded by small heaps of pebbles, placed upon every available stone in the immediate neighborhood, for the Arabs throw these pebbles in memory, as their legend runs, of the throwing of pebbles by the children of Israel upon the stones surrounding the rock, after they had drunk of its waters, and had sat down to rest. One name only, that of Paran, has lingered in the valley, of that name, apparently the same as that corrupted in Faran. Rephidim is famous, not only for the miracle of the rock, but also for the victory over Amalek. The Amalekites were of old the inhabitants of the land, as thou goest to Shur, even unto the land of Egypt. 1 Samuel chapter 27 verse 8. Evidences of their ancient occupancy remain in the ruins of the Hazeroth, or fenced enclosures. No doubt the fruitful valley of the Faran was their holding, and they saw Israel's host approaching its fertility with envy. It is probable that they beheld, from the heights around, the miracle of the rock, and, if so, they must have perceived that Israel was not dependent upon Amalek's resources for their journey towards Horeb. And their attack on Israel was an outrage upon Jehovah. Towards the evening of the day of rebellion and of mercy, Amalek fell upon Israel's rear. We may imagine the foe, like the Arabs of the Sudan, creeping down their steep glen sides and then bursting upon Israel like a torrent. Israel had said, "Is the Lord among us or not?" tempting God by their unbelief, and then came Amalek. But, nevertheless, with the enemy, came the God-given victory over him. Unbelief in God's faithfulness, God's answer of mercy, the enemy's attack, God's reply of victory, such is the golden line of God's grace over man's sin, displayed in the glory of God in the wilderness. At the head of Wadi el-Bir were several immense groups of them, scattered all over the rough open plain. The arrangement consisted of a series of very large circles, communicating for the most part one with another, and divided into separate apartments for living, sleeping, cooking, and the like. The walls were composed of large boulders of stone carefully packed together. The attack occurred about 2 months after the Exodus, towards the end of May, or early in June, when the Bedouins leave the lower plains in order to find pasture for their flocks on the Kula heights. No cause of warfare is more common than a dispute for the right of pasturage. The Amalekites were at that time the most powerful race in the peninsula, which from the earliest ages was peopled with fierce or warlike tribes, with whom the pharaohs, from the 3rd dynasty downwards, were engaged in constant struggles. The next morning battle was joined, and the manner of the combat was unique. Joshua, with spear and sword, met the foe in the valley. Moses, with the rod and uplifted hands, upon the overlooking hill, prayed for victory. So long as the intercessors' hands were uplifted, Israel prevailed, but when they slackened, Amalek gained the advantage. As the day wore on, Moses' hands grew heavy, and then the future high priest, Aaron, with her whose name signifies purity, formed a seat for the intercessor, and supporting his hands, kept them steady until the sun went down. Thus the day ended, and Israel, in the power of the uplifted hands, were more than conquerors. The lifting up of the hands has been regarded almost with unvarying unanimity by Targumists, rabbins, fathers, reformers, and nearly all the more modern commentators, as the sign or attitude of prayer. On reaching Wadi Faran, the traveler should make a pilgrimage to the hill, which was the probable station of Moses at the Battle of Rephidim. The hill, which is called Jebel Tahuna, the mountain of the windmill, is not more than 700 feet high, and is situated on the northern side of the valley. Describing the view from its summit, the writer says, "At the foot meanders Wadi Faran with its grove of palms and tamarisks, while down from either flank of Mount Serbal, which faces you, run 2 steep wadis, Elliot and Ajele, far away to the southeast. Through an opening in the hills, is seen the long blue range of the Jebel Musa Mountains. This strange victory has a significance marked out by God himself. The Lord commanded Moses to write the record of it in the book, and to rehearse it in the ears of Joshua. The leader in war service was ever to remember that the battle is won through the strength and courage imparted by virtue of the prayers of the intercessor on high. In the book which thou hast begun to write." What book was this? No other book has ever been heard of that has been attributed to Moses by the Hebrew Church, but the Pentateuch. Amalek in a peculiar way is a type of the enemy. He feared not God. Against Amalek the Lord will have war from generation to generation, and he will utterly put out, or wipe out, the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. Exodus chapter 17 verses 16-14. See Deuteronomy chapter 25 verses 18 to 19. Does not this refer to Amalek's unbelief in the power of God displayed in the smiting of the rock? The symbolic character of the day's strange combat is apparent, and taking it in its sequence after the smitten rock, it is well expounded by these verses. It is Christ that died, yea, rather, that is risen again, who is even at the right hand of God, who also maketh intercession for us. We are more than conquerors through him that loved us. Romans chapter 8 verses 34-37. The scriptures are definite as to the attitude of Christ in his ascent to heaven, and of his service there. He lifted up his hands and blessed them. And, while he blessed them, he was carried up into heaven. Luke chapter 24 verses 50-51. This same Jesus, which is taken up from you into heaven, shall so come in like manner as ye have seen him go into heaven. Acts chapter 1 verse 11. He ever liveth to make intercession, made higher than the heavens. Hebrews chapter 7 verses 25-26. On the site of the victory Moses built an altar to Jehovah, and called it Jehovah Nissi, Jehovah my banner. Not such a banner, with emblems of the gods, as the Egyptian armies rallied around, but an altar of burnt sacrifice, the tribute of worship to the unchangeable I Am. And in connection therewith Moses said, "A hand is lifted up upon the throne of Jah." A war of the Lord against Amalek from generation to generation, prophetic words, indicating the final victory of the people of God, for the mighty hand of the intercessor is laid upon the divine throne, and at the sundown, as it were, of this world's day, victory shall remain with the soldiers of God. And thus stands the record, written by the divine command in the book of God, the war proceeding still, the final victory still to come. Exodus chapter 17 verse 16. The words are variously translated. The margin of the Revised Version has it, because there is a hand against the throne of the Lord. Hebrew, a hand is lifted up upon the throne of Jah. The overthrow of Amalek opened Israel's way to the valleys at the foot of the Horeb range of mountains, and led to the realization of the promise made to Moses at the burning bush. This shall be a token unto thee, that I have sent thee. When thou hast brought forth the people out of Egypt, ye shall serve God upon this mountain. Exodus chapter 3 verse 12. The Horeb district was familiar ground to the former shepherd of Midian. And when settled before the mountains, Jethro visited Israel's camp to hear in Moses' tent the story of God's wonderful ways, to rejoice for all the goodness which Jehovah had done to Israel. Exodus chapter 18 verse 9. The whole plain is called Wadi Rahah, and the valley of the convent is known to the Arab as Wadi Shuib, that is, the Vale of Jethro. This might be said to be but a very natural act, but it is not recorded simply as a piece of history. A religious ceremony was bound up with it. Jethro, being with Israel, took a burnt offering and made sacrifice to God, and also peace offerings. He and all the elders of Israel joined in worship and communion. But it is said Jethro ate bread before God, not before Jehovah, for it was not by his name, Jehovah, that God was related to the Midianite. In this significant act of worship is a picture of the coming day, when all enemies being vanquished, Jew and Gentile shall worship and commune together before God. Then, too, will Christ share with his chosen people the rule and the government, as did Moses on the suggestion of Jethro share his rule with the heads of Israel. His intercommunion in sacrifice at Horeb before God with Moses, Aaron, and the elders of Israel reveals a glimpse of that blessed time, when all worshippers of God will be united together in adoration of him. The Holy Bible with notes. The interest in the incidents which are before us in this chapter is so great that we have supplied a map of that part of the Pharaoh in which they occurred. On the left, supposing we are on the way to Horeb, facing Jebel Serbal, is the hill Tahuna, before reaching which is located the traditional rock, Hezi el Kataton. Near Tahuna is the position of Rephidim. Some 20 miles up the valley, and the plain of Rahah is gained. Thus do the recorded incidents of these 2 weeks present 2 pictures of the divine purpose in reference to man. The first, of Christ, the manna, sustaining and supporting the people of God in their heavenward way, and the Sabbath of God being reached and enjoyed through him. No enemies are in view in this picture. The unbelief and the needs of the people of God and Christ, in his excellence, are the main objects before the spiritual eye. The second picture is of Christ as the smitten rock. Christ, under the judgment of God on man's account, and from him once smitten, the living waters pouring out for man, through the Spirit. Then the enemy appears to hinder and to destroy, but by virtue of Christ's intercession on high, the enemy is vanquished. Finally, men, as one family on earth, are seen communing together and worshipping together before the living God, even as the scriptures continually declare shall be the case in the coming kingdom. In these pictures we see the glory of Jehovah, Exodus 16:7, as we look with Israel toward the wilderness. Verse 10, we see his glory on the dew-covered ground, and in the rest of the holy Sabbath unto Jehovah. Verse 23, we see his glory as his cloud surmounts the smitten rock whence the life-giving waters flow. Ch. 17-6, and as the story of the wilderness unfolds, glory upon glory will unfold also.